Everyone, I'm Matt, the Storytime Guy, and today we're going to be talking about Aztec Warfare. We're going to talk about weapons, armors, religious aspects, the Flower War, and some fun information like prostitutes were brought onto the battlefield. You're going to have a great time, so sit back, relax, and enjoy, because it's story time. And this episode is brought to you by Trolley Sour Bright Crawlers. So let's start with weapons. What weapons did the Aztec warriors use? Now, for starters, they weren't called the Aztec warriors. They were called the Mexica. They were part of the Nahua people. We call them Aztecs because of a Spaniard who wasn't very smart and he mistranslated a few things and he got Aztecat, the Holy Land, for the Mexica, confused, and he's like Aztecat, Azteca people. There you go. Fun lesson about the Aztec. So, when it comes to the actual weaponry of what the Aztec used to use, it's really important that we define why they used that weapons, and more importantly, we define the fact that the Aztec were not the only nation, and they were a very specific case. So, there were literally hundreds of nations who all used different weaponry, right? So the Maya, not Mayan, that's the language. Language, Mayan. People, Maya. The Maya people used bows and arrows very, very effectively. They were really, really, really damn good. They weren't big warriors. They were definitely not a warrior nation, right? The Maya wasn't even an empire. It was a series of small empires that were kind of like, yeah, we're all Maya. We all speak the same language, but we're really not connected to each other. And they, however, used bows. They would, what worked really great against the Spaniards during the Spanish-Aztec War was the Mayas would come in and they would shoot. So they would have like 4 or 5 small units and they would bring the Spanish warriors out to them or the other indigenous people that sided with the Spaniards. And then when they would come, they would have like 5 people like, we got this, easy peasy. And then like 50 other dudes with bows and arrows would come in, just unload on them and then run. This was not like, they were smart enough, and arguably Mayas were probably the smartest indigenous tribe in all of the Americas. And they knew, like, I don't give a damn about honor, I don't give a damn about religion, like, we're trying to kill you. However we're going to outsmart you, we're going to outsmart you. The Aztec didn't feel that same way. A lot of battles that happened between the Aztec and the Spanish War, the Aztecs I'm going to say Aztec, the Mexica, but the Aztec outright won them. I mean, they beat the shit out of the Spaniards several times. The problem is that their religious aspects held them back. So when it comes to Aztec battles, right, they go into war not to kill people. In fact, the elite warriors would never kill a single person on the battlefield. And if you're like, that's not how war works, it is for them, because war wasn't meant to kill people, it was meant to bring people to be sacrificed. You can't kill someone and say, oh, he's been sacrificed. It's not the way they viewed things. You had to defeat people. Now, it was usually bigger targets, bigger elite units. If you want to give it like a game, it's like the smaller bad guys, you kill those, no big deal, right? Bigger bad guys, you want to defeat them, smash them into submission, and then bring them back mostly alive. That's how they did things. So when they were going to war with the Spaniards, they would often, and this happened with other indigenous nations too, is that they would beat them, and then like, all right, well, we got enough people to be sacrificed. Let's get going. And the other nations like, we're not going to let you leave, or they would just tactically retreat and go, oh, okay, sure, yeah, you go, and we'll go too, and we'll pick ourselves back up. And that happened a lot. So with that introduction of like how they did war, why they did things the way they did, now we can dive into the legendary weapon, one of the coolest weapons across the world, the Makwawit, right? That's how you say it. Makwawit, right? TL is a tla, HU is a wa, Makwawit. So the Makwawit, or the Obsidian War Club, is a long wooden club with obsidian blades glued in to the sides of it, and obsidian is one of the sharpest things in the world, and it would cut right through. Now, obsidian is very brittle, and that actually worked in their favor. When you sliced at someone, the obsidian pieces would break, right? And it was excruciating pain, so much so you just kind of just fall over. Not dead, be like, God, I want to die. And that worked in their favor because they didn't want to kill you then. They wanted you to be submitted. So another thing, too, is that you have to remember they didn't really have access to a lot of irons. They had bronze, and they did use bronze axes, which I'll cover in a second. But for the most part, they had obsidian in an abundance. So what do you do when you have something in abundance? You use it and use it properly, right? So they had these war clubs, and the blades weren't long. If you're doing fantasy stuff, you have to understand, they weren't trying to kill people. They slashed at your skin. They slashed through your armor. Yes, indigenous people of the Americas had armor. They had helmets. They had breastplates. And they would kind of beat you in submission. So they slice you and then they beat you down like with a paddle, right? And I always joke, though, some people say like, oh, how'd they beat the Spaniards? They were in armor. Well, if Few things. One, the Spaniards quickly took off their armor. It was too damn hot for them to be wearing all that armor all the time. And in fact, they adopted indigenous armor because it just worked better for the instance, right? Spanish armor is great against other knights. When you're fighting someone who is beating you to death, it's not very helpful. And that's kind of the point, is that the Spaniards were like, oh, like they've got obsidian blades. And I see people, oh, the obsidian blades would never get through armor. They didn't need to, right? Because the best thing, and anyone can tell you this and knows anything a damn about weapons and armor, the best thing to get through armor is to just beat them to death. Blunt trauma. That is the best way to do it, and you can do that, and that's what they did, and that's how they defeated them. Obsidians wouldn't work, so they just beat you. Because one of the weapons they did have was this hammer. It was a long stick with a heavy wooden or bronze or metal ball that was welded or attached to the end of it, and they would just beat you with that, and it worked great against armor. And in fact, you'll see many people in medieval times, in the 1500s, when it came to arts, when they weren't using guns and ballistics and firearms, they were using maces. Swords were really ineffective against armor. So, the Makwawit, right, the Obsidian War Club, this is a really unique weapon because, like I said, it was made for sacrificial purposes. You were made to go in there, use it, blah, blah, blah. And there's many sizes and varieties to the Makwawit, right? There's the handheld one, which could range between like 2 to 3 feet at most. Then there was a polearm version of it. So the handle was about 4 to 5 feet. And then you had the Makwawit at the end of that. So there's a polearm version of it. There's a spear version of it where it's a very long 6 foot, 7 foot long stick. And then there was a small variation of the Makwawit, the Obsidian War blades at the end of it. So there's a lot of different varieties of this. They didn't only ever use the Makwawit. They used shields with it, but oftentimes they would use a spear because the spear was better. Another thing they used was the at, right? ATL, at. That is the spear thrower. That sucker was dangerous. So there was a little wooden stick where you would put the spear on it. And that little wooden stick, because of the way it was designed, would increase the spear's power, velocity, and precision and distance by insane measures. So really, when they threw that sucker, it was dangerous. You wouldn't be like, oh, they're throwing spears. But with the atlat, the spear thrower, that sucker would fly, and it would fly fast and far and be very deadly. And because it's obsidian tip, that sucker's going right through you, and it is going to be painful. So you have the Atlat spear thrower, you have the Makwawit, right? You have the variations of the Makwawit, you have bronze axes, right? So one of the big indigenous nations that were able to defeat the Aztecs used bronze axes, okay? Because they also, once again, they didn't believe in the religious practices the Aztec believed in. We're like, oh, we're going to go sacrifice you. They're like, we're going to kill you if you come to war with us. And they were one of the reasons there was a few nations that just couldn't beat the Aztecs, couldn't beat, or they didn't want to put enough effort into beating them or change their religious point of views, because the people would walk out with axes and swords and bronze breastplates and helmets and be like, all right, square up. And the Aztecs were like, no thank you. So yeah, they had bronze axes, they had bronze hammers. They could throw them, they could wield them. There's not any instances of giant bronze axes, but in theory there could have been. We know that claws and blades and daggers were a big thing. The Maya people were the first people in the world to figure out how to rip out a person's chest like that. It was a really impressive feat that Spaniards were recorded as saying they were jealous of because they couldn't figure it out. Because you were able to, while the person was still alive, right? Able to take an obsidian dagger, slice down their chest, rip out their heart while it was still beating, and they would still be alive. Impressive. And I don't want to hear anyone going, oh, that's barbaric, those savages. Bro, the Los Angeles Torture Museum, which is a 1-hour experience, is exclusively just Spanish death traps. I mean, you want to talk about torture and really messed up ways to kill and sacrifice people? Go talk to the Spaniards and all those fucked up things they did, man. Because I'm going to tell you, they didn't mess around when it came to torturing people, and they got really archaic with it. So I don't want to hear anyone say, blah, 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 indigenous. Look, every culture, every society has messed up people, has good people. Religion makes people do silly things sometimes, okay? So let's move forward with that, okay? We don't need any backwards ignorance, all right? So going forward, this is a war talk, right? So we're talking war, we're talking bows, the atlat. And one of the other things that they did was use armor, right? So a big portion of the armor was this kind of it's like lacquered breastplates. So it was they would take this like clothing, linen, and they would dunk it in salt water to the point that it would harden, and that's what they would use to deflect weapons, and it worked great. I mean, it's lacquered. Even nowadays, It's not perfect, but those suckers are bulletproof to an extent, at least enough that if a bullet was glancing you, it wouldn't outright kill you. So they inadvertently created bulletproof vests, so which was once again great accidental tool against the Spaniards. So also their helmets, right? They wore helmets. I've seen people say like, oh, they didn't have. They absolutely had helmets. We have depictions of them in statues and everything. I mean, they've had helmets for thousands of years. Look at the Olmec. So they did have helmets. They did have breastplates. They did have various armors on them. And another thing to note about that is the headdresses, right? So in more indigenous Native Americans to the United States, I'm talking Navajo, Cherokee, usually in those nations, only the chiefs or really, really important people of power would don the headdresses, right? The Aztecs and most of Middle Central America, when it comes to the Mexica, the Nahuatl people, the Aztec, the Maya, they didn't have that opinion, right? Mostly because they were from different indigenous nations, but also because they believed that expression to yourself was really important when it came to your looks. So a lot of times you will see a lot of really intricate designs, right? And everything meant something. Your hair. I mean, there's like 60 different hairstyles, and every single one of them meant something else. A woman who was married, she would often have her hair braided up and then haloed around her head to signify that she was married, right? And that was the same with the warriors. Warriors, your hairstyle depended on what rank you were. So you would often have your hair in a braid, just a single braid down your hair or a ponytail, and that would signify that you were a new warrior. And as you grew up in ranks, you could do different things with your hair that only people in your ranking or status were allowed to do. And we see that with the biggest example is the shorn ones. These are so they were allowed to mohawk their hair. And they were the only people in indigenous society, not kings, not queens, not anyone, not priests. These were the only people in the entire society that could mohawk their hair, right? Because the shorn ones were the elite. They were the elite shock trooper unit. There was only like 5 of them on a battlefield. If it was like 500 versus 500, it'd be 5, maybe 10 shorn ones, and they would kill, just brutalize everyone. I mean, these were the guys that were like, I'm going for the king. So they would just brute force their way through the enemy forces, and just get to that king and kill him, whoever's in charge. That was their job, and they did it really well. And this was a career path. Now, the Aztecs and the Maya, none of them had standing armies. They were all trained in war, and there was a few warriors they had warrior academies and schools. But as a whole, majority of people were trained as warriors, and when wartime came, they all came up and they fought together and they go back to their actual jobs, right? Which was common around the world. That's what most people did back then. They didn't have standing armies. They were just farmers and stuff. So when it comes to this sort of war, you have to understand when someone chooses to be a warrior, that was a big deal. When someone gets to a point where they're like, hey, I have something that not even the king has, you have to understand how lethal and dangerous they were. And one of the other big things about them was paint, right? So paint meant a lot. Every color meant something else, meant something. And it signified something. So you'd go on the battlefield and you'd see dozens of people with different paint, different designs, different hair, different headdresses, different armors, different weapons. Everything meant something. It was honestly like a video game. Like you're playing an MMO and you're like, that guy's a warlock, that guy's a sorcerer, that guy's a warrior. Everything meant something else, or meant something. So when the shorn ones, they were painted in yellow because yellow is the color of the jaguar. It is the color of ferocity. It is the color of just unabashed violence. So a lot of people think like snakes are like evil, slithery. No, the people that did stealth were jaguars and the shadows. So you'd have black and yellow, and those were the people that attacked from the shadows. So when you didn't have black and you only had yellow, that was a signifying that you were just hardcore, that you were just gonna like just be ferocious. You think red would be like the thing, but not for them. Yellow was the big color. That was the ferocity. That was the danger. You see a guy painted yellow, you get out of his way, or you attack him from afar. Because he was head to toe in armor, mohawk, face paint. I believe his face paints were sometimes red and blue, which also signified different things. Red is fire. Red is all consuming. Blue is more of a wise king because they are smart, they are trained, they're not just running in there head first, they are smart about this, but they are dangerous. So really, when you see that, you kind of just go, no, not doing this. And those were the shorn ones, right? And every warrior had different colors, they had different weapons, they had different hairstyles. And so it wasn't just like a bunch of, I think we get this idea that's like a bunch of dudes with loincloths and like some metal bracers, like everyone's looking like Namor from Black Panther Wakanda Forever, like, yeah, that's what they all look like. No, it's like, everyone has this opinion of Spartans from 300 going, oh, they're all in like bronze tantarans, and they got bracers and a helmet, and that's what they wear, and they wear nothing protecting their chest. Come on, these people aren't idiots. They know what vital organs are. They know what to protect those, right? So yeah, so like I said, a war was hardcore. Um, Appearances meant a lot. Armor meant a lot. Weapons meant a lot. Every weapon was for different uses. Every nation had a different use for a different weapon. Um, and so next, I want to talk about the religious aspect of it. I kind of touched on it earlier. You can't really, you wanted to sacrifice people, but there was it was more than that, right? So honor bound. It's so funny. We always think of like samurais, but you could argue that the indigenous Aztec were just as, if not more, honor bound than samurai, because a warrior never killed someone running away. They never killed someone in general, usually, because you need that person to be sacrificed. And you never use stealth, you never use poison, you never use trickery to kill someone. That was like the high bar to jump. They were like, why would I do these things? I'm a man, I'm a warrior, I'm gonna beat you face to face, right? And so, and that was very much religiously inclined. They were like, look, am a vessel for the gods. I am going to beat you into submission, bring you to the god, and show you, hey, I brought this king from this tribe. I brought this general. I brought this priest. I defeated this. This is my sacrifice. Because also, their country, the empire would reward them as such. The more people you brought in, the more advances you went in society, right? So in society, think of it like a permit, like a learner's pass, right? So when you were a warrior, when you were nothing, right, just an average citizen, let's say, you weren't allowed to drink alcohol. You weren't allowed to have sex with people. You weren't allowed to do anything when it came to your freedoms of like outside of normal freedoms, like perks, like, oh, like I can get all these weapons. You couldn't do any of that, right? You had to earn the right. And so in that aspect, you had to go to war. And if you were able to defeat anyone in combat and bring them back alive, you were then rewarded. You were given that little chim, here's your pass. And in those instances, yeah, you wore a white loincloth, you had your hair done up in a little braid, and you had a spear and maybe a shield, and that was it. Oftentimes, you were carrying another warrior's weapons, and if that warrior succeeded and you helped him and he felt you helped him, then he'd be like, yeah, this guy, give him the nod, he helped, give him his pass. And so, that's what happened. That's what they would do. So you had these people that, like, if you were in love, like, oh, I would love to bang you, you'd be like, all right, well, go get someone to be sacrificed, and that's what it would do. So that was the basic level, right? One person, you get someone to be sacrificed. One person, or like I said, you get waived for it. Someone you can pay your way into it. Different ways to do this, right? So you are going into this and saying, hey, I brought this body back. What do I get now? And they go, okay, well, first off, if you're younger when you do this, if you're a teenager or a young man when you do this, you can opt into a school to now, like, hey, you've proven yourself. Do you want to go to warrior school, or do you want to keep being a farmer, right? You can have alcohol. You can't get drunk. Still illegal. You can drink alcohol. I believe it was like 1 cup a day at most, but no more than 5 a week. 5 was a very unlucky number for the Aztec. And then, yeah, you could have sex with one woman who you had to marry, right? So yeah, you're pretty much like, hey, who's the one lady I want to be with? But the moment you get past 5, so you bring 5 people back. The number changes, by the way. This is just kind of the assumption. Once you bring back a certain amount of people, we'll say 5. Then it upped. It upped what you could do, the property you could buy, where you could live. Everything started going up, and the more people you brought in, the more you're allowed to get. And it gets to a certain point where after 20 is when you get considered an elite warrior, and that's when you can have polygamy is opened. The door for polygamy is opened up. They weren't like big on it, and a lot of people are like, no, they didn't do it, but they like definitely did. It was just like, it was against the law, but like to a certain elite few was okay. They kind of just looked the other way. But yeah, so you were allowed to just polygamy. You still had your wife, and you had to respect that she was your wife, because you couldn't cheat on her. You're pretty much like, hey, you couldn't like take on multiple wives. You could take on multiple lovers, right? So you had your wife, and you could take on multiple lovers. And this was the same for women too. It was a very rare thing to see a woman on the battlefield. As a warrior, I'll get into women's place on a battlefield outside of being warriors. But we do know that many tribes, and the Aztec included, did have female warriors, and they were allowed the same graces that a man could. And it was just for a woman, their place was kind of in terms at the time of being housewives and matrimony. So you would like help other women, give birth. You would help other women with their children, and that was kind of your path into doing this, as well as priesthood, as well as brothels. Um, yeah, you could rise up in society working at a brothel. If you were a man or a woman, it was more common for women, but men did it too. And they worshiped the god of gays, the flower prince, Xochipilli. He was their protector, and they worshipped him. And yeah, so they would, if you were really good at your job at a brothel, you could rise up in the ranks and get to become a noble. Um, and I'm just going to jump into that one. Yeah, they would bring prostitutes onto the battlefield, especially for young up and coming warriors. They would say, "Hey, see this big booty, big titty, indigenous woman? Well, they're all indigenous, but bring this beautiful woman. She's yours for tonight if you bring back someone, if you do good in this battlefield." And all the young warriors would fight like their lives depended on it because A, they were all virgins, and B, she was likely very, very beautiful. And C, this is like, okay, cool. And you got to remember, that didn't count towards your like one and only. So it was very, very smart of them to like use sex as a weapon, and it worked. They would tell the guys and the girls and everything. And once again, this wasn't only for women. They brought men onto the battlefield who served the exact same purpose. They would, if you were more inclined to having fun with a guy, then that guy would be waiting for you. If you were more inclined to satisfy your needs with a woman, that woman would be waiting for you. So it really was this kind of sex as a weapon to make their warriors fight better, and it worked. There's a whole god of war / lust. She was called Tlazolteotl, the filth eater, or the goddess of filth, because she was the purifier as well as the filth giver, right? So she was all about like giving into your carnal urges, and then she'd punish you if you gave too much. But also, there's a certain level of lust that you need in life, or that she felt. So really, when it came to her, she actually had these elite units of warrior prostitutes. Now, I can't find the name of them off the top of my head. I was looking for it. I wrote it down somewhere. But there was this elite prostitute warrior unit where it was mostly women, but there was a few men, and they would go onto the battlefield and they would fight next to you, right? So there's prostitutes waiting back at camp. I'm sorry, excuse me. So there's prostitutes waiting for you back at camp. But there were also prostitutes that were fighting alongside you, man. And like they would be looking out for the other warriors. They were also priests, so they knew how to sacrifice. They knew all these things. And they're pretty much like the bard, the jack of all trades, but like super dangerous. So they knew how to fight, they knew priestly stuff, and they knew how to satisfy people. So you had this like triple threat woman, usually women, it could have been a man sometimes, but it was usually women who would go onto the battlefield, they'd fight, they'd kill, they'd protect, they'd sacrifice right there. They'd sacrifice to the gods right on the spot because they had the right to, which some priests did go to the battlefield and did do that. But these women were like super elite warriors. And then after they'd satisfy whoever either they wanted, whoever they felt deserved it. And like that was their job. They were really, really good. And I have to really iterate, like people are like, oh, okay. But like, that's a crazy impressive thing. That's like being like you're a sniper and you know how to use magic and like you know how to fight hand-to-hand combat. Like that's crazy. That's like if Jackie Chan was also really, which he probably is, hey. But it's like that's if Jackie Chan was like, oh, also I know how to satisfy anybody's needs and I speak 30 languages. You're like, what the Jackie Chan? I didn't know you could do all that. It's amazing, and I'm not at all surprised because you're perfect in every way, Jackie Chan. But yeah, so it was really interesting to see how they were. Because remember, and I'm talking specifically about the Aztec and the Mexica, they were a warrior nation. Their entire society revolved around war, religion, and war. Other nations did not believe in this stuff. They did not sacrifice people. They did not do these things, but the Aztec did, right? And also, the amount of Aztec gods that actually sacrificed people is very, very small. You had Tlaloc, the god of rain and storms. He sacrificed one child a year through drowning. You had Huitzilopochtli, the god of war. He was like, nah, y'all gonna kill like a dozen people every time you go to war in my name. Xipetotec, the lord of the flayed ones, he would want people to sacrifice at the beginning of the farming year because he's like, blood goes into the ground, it goes back to the earth, we get back, There's other people that didn't. There was other people that sacrificed animals. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, he didn't sacrifice anything or anyone. He didn't like it. And that's probably due in part because he's not an Aztec god. He's a much older, he's probably one of the oldest gods in the Americas, if not the oldest god in the Americas, because he spans to the Arawak, the Tainos, the indigenous, the Mayas. He's very, very old. And so he didn't like sacrifice at all. And then like someone like the Flower Prince and his sister, the Flower Feather, so Xochipilli and Xochiquetzal, they just sacrifice quails because they're both gay. The god of lesbians and the god of gays, of course, the animal they sacrifice is quails. So yeah, it was a very interesting thing. Let me see. So yeah, flower wars. Okay, so a flower war is when um, two people or two opposing factions agree to a fight. Right? Think of it like a sports arena. Like, hey, the Chargers and the Rams are going to fight each other on this day on this point. Except instead of playing football, these dudes are fighting with swords, right? And the whole point is to not kill anyone. In fact, no one would be killed on the battlefield. That was not that kind of thing. Oftentimes, they'd get 100 people and 100 people from both sides, and then meet up on a specific date and time, and they'd go to war with each other, which is why it was called a flower war, because it wasn't a real war. They would treat it like a real war. They would have battle strategies and all this stuff, but at the end of the day, they weren't trying to kill anyone. And these were a lot more elite units. You wouldn't usually see someone who was like a new guy, like, hey guys, this is my first time. You wouldn't see that. These are like the elite. And so you had 100 elite versus elite, and they battled and they beat each other. And then at the end of, like, because there would be a time, so it'd be like from sun up to sundown. At sundown or after an hour or whatever, they would agree and say like, hey, I captured these guys. I captured 5 dudes, and you captured 4 dudes. So I'll take back 4 dudes, right? And you have no one, and I'll keep 1, but you get your 5 back, or you get your 4 back, right? So it was pretty much a way to kind of get sacrifices without spilling too much blood. It was a really smart tool. They came up with it later in their society, but they still came up with it, and I think more societies should have done this, because this was a really smart idea to just make sure innocent people didn't die, to make sure idiots who shouldn't have been on the battlefield didn't die. These were elite warriors trained. Having said that, there was a bit of kind of a caveat to all this. The Aztec were pound for pound the best warriors. They were the quickest, the fastest, the strongest, the toughest. They when it came to flower wars, there's no recorded instance of them ever losing one, and they did a lot of them. So this is pretty much like Tom Brady's the Patriots going to war and being like, all right, like, we're gonna win, but how badly are we gonna win? Are we gonna beat you 60-2, or are we gonna be like, it's closer like 35-34, you know? So that's how that's kind of like the caveat to the, like, oh, like, that's nice of them to do this, but they did do this with the intention of winning, and they always did. And maybe it was by, maybe they only got like 1 or 2 dudes, but maybe they got 20 or 30, depending on the nation, depending on who they were fighting, depending on what they were feeling. A lot of times too, the Aztecs were very, very, very spiteful. If a lot of times too, some nations would send their, so it was this really weird, there was this invisible line when it came to the Aztecs, right? They wanted you to fight them and send your best, but if you put up too good of a fight, they didn't like that, because that made them look bad. So then they might actually threaten war with you. Having said that, there's an opposite effect, that if they felt you sent them their worst warriors, they would get disrespected and be like, dude, what are you doing? I don't want to sacrifice losers. Don't send me guys who don't know how to fight. So there was this line, this invisible line, where the Aztec would want, and like I said, Aztec weren't the only ones to do flower wars. A lot of nations did flower wars with each other, because a lot of times you wouldn't even necessarily, like, other nations who weren't big on sacrifice, they would do flower wars with the intention of going like, hey, I got 3 of your elite warriors. Give me $1,000, or, $500 for each one, and then I'll give you them back. So sometimes these nations wouldn't even go to kill or sacrifice. They would just go for money. They would fight, and they would gamble, and they'd bet, and then they would be, all right, you guys got this, and you guys got this, and I'll see you next month, The Aztecs, though, usually were for sacrifice, and they usually, they didn't take too kindly. There's one story, I believe, of the Aztecs, that they were doing a flower war, and they nearly lost it, and everyone was like, oh, the Aztec are weak, and another nation attacked the Aztec, and the Aztec were like furious that they're like, so they killed that nation, brutalized that nation, destroyed them, wiped them off the face of the earth, because they're like, how dare you think we're weak? And then they went to the guys that almost beat them, and they're like, hey, we can't have this. You can't do this. And so they, like, just exterminated them too. That's only happened like once, and it was under a specific king who was pretty mean. But yeah, these things happen, right? Depending, kings can be crazy. So the final thing I want to talk about when it comes to Aztec weaponry and Aztec armors and all this stuff is this aspect of religion, right? So there was this really cool, I know I already said religion, but there's this a religious aspect that follows after, right? So when it came to the, like, getting people, a lot of people don't know this, but the Aztecs actually had a coliseum. They had an arena, and what they would do is that they would let you, so to kind of give you this idea, 2 things. One, let's talk about slavery real quick, right? So slavery in sorry, that was really casual. Let's talk about slavery. Yeah, guys, slavery. Isn't it fun? So, and when it came to the Aztec, Mexica and the Nahuatl people and everything, slavery was a very unique thing. We would look at it more like serfs. We wouldn't necessarily call them slaves. They weren't allowed to be abused. You weren't there for life. You were never. It was outside of war, never against your will. Um, and the slave masters could not harm you in any sense of the word. In fact, Tezcatlipoca, the Lord of the Smoking Mirror, the God of gods, the penultimate God of evil and shadows and magic, the one God you never cross. He was also the God of slaves, and he made sure that slaves were very treated very nicely. Because if you didn't, he personally went after you. And for these people who are very religious, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't want to piss off the one God who's notoriously obscenely violent. Like when we see the portrait of the God of War is violent, and like you're like, oh my god, like you read stories about like how he just like brutalizes people. It's because of his uncle Tezcatlipoca. He's the one encouraging him, and he like. I, I'll talk about it another day. Go follow my Aztec mythology series. But let me just tell you, this is a god you didn't mess with, and no one did. And so slaves were they were more like workers, right? Because you have to remember, when it came to the Aztec and indigenous societies at the time, they didn't have pack animals. They didn't have donkeys. They didn't have horses. They didn't have cows. They didn't have any animal that could actually carry stuff. So they needed people to carry things and move things and do things that a horse or an animal or thing would do. And most people don't want to do that. So usually slavery. You would either have warriors or you would have people who were maybe born very poor, and they say, look, I need this. I'm going to pay you good for this, but like I own you, and then when you're done, you can leave. So that's how it kind of went. People were down on the luck, prisoners and stuff. This is what they did. They'd say, hey, go farm for a month and then you're out. You know? But like I said, there was no beating. They weren't mistreated. They were treated very well. They had comfortable living arrangements and stuff. It was actually one of the surprising things that for me at least, you're like, they actually treated slaves very, very nicely. So back to the arena, right? So let's say you're a warrior, right? And once again, I'm speaking this, and I feel like, Hollywood, are you listening, man? So anyways, so you go to war with the Aztec, okay? Let's say you get your butt kicked, right? One of those Shorn One motherfuckers comes up to you and just like wails on you, and you're like, God, stab! Beats you into submission, ties you up with a rope. Likely he'd have someone who's traveling with him who would tie you up with a rope, and then they drag you back while the Shorn One goes out to do more stuff. And what would happen is that you would get put in a cage usually, or tied down, and they'd carry you back to an arena, right? It depended on the festival, depending on the time, depended on why they were going to war and all this stuff. But usually you'd get put into an arena. It wasn't a giant coliseum like Rome. Don't think of it like that. It was much smaller, but it still could fit a few hundred people. And they would put you on this a stone pedestal. It's like a small little, like 3-foot tall pedestal made of stone, and there was a kind of a like how do you put that? Like a little bar in the middle that they tie a rope to, or they tie you to a weight, depending on the area, and they give you a wooden stick. So it was a makwa wheat without the obsidian blades on it. And then they'd have 2, 3, 1, 4, 5 warriors with actual weapons come out, and they surround you. Or they'd go one at a time, it depends, right? And they'd say, all right, fight for your freedom back. And so you had to use a weapon with no blades and defeat warriors who weren't elite, but they were warriors. And oftentimes, as you can imagine, it didn't end well, right? You got a guy with a stick, like, fighting a guy who has a sword. It's usually not going to end well. But if it did end well for you, if you were able to defeat the guys or put on a good enough show and show like you have ferocity, they'd likely let you go. They'd say, there was a caveat, they wouldn't just let you go. So they would either put you into slavery where you work it off, or they say, hey, like, we'll let you be bought back because like your nation deserves you because you're a good warrior. You got beat the first time, but you earned it the second time. Now, if you were able to get free, congrats. If you were able to become a slave, still better than being dead. If you couldn't, though, if you were defeated, if they did slash you and you didn't put on a good show and you were like, oh, whatever, this guy's not making it, what they would do is then they'd take you up to the pyramid. Once again, depends on the festival, and they'd kill you. They'd sacrifice you. Every god had a different way to sacrifice people. We supposedly loved the heart ripping. He loved beheading. I think Tezcatlipoca specifically loved beheadings. Xipetotec, Lord of the Flayed Ones, he liked arrows. So it's the weirdest thing. I like it. So I'm not saying the sacrifice is weird. I'm saying his methods were weird, right? So Shipatotic, Lord of the Flayed Ones. I want you to take a guess what the Lord of the Flayed Ones does, right? His priest would wear the skins of people, right? So they'd kill people, cut their hands off, cut their feet off, and then wear them like a jumpsuit. Swear to God. And he himself wore that outfit, right? So he wore the skin of flame because it was said that he only had a mouth and no eyes and nose. And so he would wear the skin of a flayed one. And that's what they would do. So with Shipatotic, though, he would shoot you with arrows. So you'd be standing at the top of the pyramid and being tied down, and he'd shoot you with arrows. And this is, once again, Hollywood silly nonsense. Arrows don't get stuck in you. You don't turn you into a pin needle, right? Arrows go through you. So they would shoot you with arrows. The arrows would fly through you. They'd pierce your body. You'd fall back with holes in you, and you'd bleed all over the pyramid. The blood would fall down the pyramid. It'd stain it. It'd look beautiful to them. And that was a sacrifice, right? But then he'd like, all right, go guys, get it, cut their skin off. And now you have a skin with a bunch of holes in it. I don't know. It just seems silly to me. I would just, if I wanted a skin suit, I wouldn't want one with holes in it. I'm just saying. Anyways. But yeah, so it was a really interesting thing how they sacrificed, why they sacrificed. War was this really huge part of everything. And I'm going to get to the final point. So I just remembered my final point, right? The gods. So if you're doing a fantasy series, if you're doing anything, right? When it comes to Aztec society, Aztec mythology, Aztec fantasy, Aztec lore, world building, whatever, take what I said into account, right? Makwawits are sacrificial tools. They are a tool meant to beat someone, slash at them, to defeat them, right? So, ask yourself, would a god use a Makwawit? The answer should obviously be no. Who is a god sacrificing a person to? Nobody. Themselves? That's not how that works. Gods didn't use Makwawits. Okay? There isn't a single instance of a single painting, drawing, description of any god, warriors or otherwise, ever wielding a Makwawit. That was not their weapon. They didn't want it. If they wanted to kill you, they'd kill you. Half of them, not even half of them, all of them could use magic. I mean, we have the story of the Four Sons has literal like 6 or 7 gods that do world-ending feats, so they don't need a Makwawit. And even when they did, they had magical tools. Tezcatlipoca had a spear, a staff with a circle in it that could see through the future. But yeah, so when you're doing your fantasies designs, if you guys are like, oh, Aztec, don't give the gods the Makwawit. Okay, it doesn't make any sense. They weren't sacrificing to themselves. They were killing you. And if they did that, guess what weapon they used? A spear. Almost all of them are depicted with arrows or spears and shields, right? That was their thing. Because that's what killed people. They didn't want to, they want to sacrifice you. They kill you because they're a god. So yeah, so that's just a final note. I keep seeing people, art and stuff where they're like, Huitzilopochtli with a Makwawit. He did, especially Huitzilopochtli. The god of war didn't wield a Makwawit. He wielded a war club. So it was a stone war club that looked like a snake. It was a turquoise snake, because he loved turquoise. It wasn't even his, actually. It was given him by his uncles. And it would turn into or summon fire or turn into a dragon. There's a lot of different instances of what it could do. At the end of the day, that sucker was like the most powerful tool in all of Aztec mythology. It was a turquoise snake. It was called the Xiuquatl, which means fire snake or comet snake, depending on how you define Xiu. And it was a giant freaking stone mace that could turn into a dragon, turn him into a dragon, summon a dragon, spit fire. It was also, I don't know how he did it. I don't know like the precision, I guess, of this thing, but he used it to slice his sister up into pieces when she tried to kill him. So like his sister like waged war and stuff, and don't wage war against the god of war, duh. But she tried, so it was stated that he sliced her to bits with that weapon. And I'm like, how do you slice someone up with a mace? Good lord. I don't know. You tell me in the comments. What do you think? How do you slice someone to bits with a mace? Maybe it was a dragon, like I said. I don't know. Anyways, now you know a little bit more about the Xiuquatl. This video did run long. I apologize for that, but I think this was really, really cool. I hope you enjoyed it, everyone. And if you have any questions, feel free to comment. Hit me up on my other social media at The Storytime Guy. Once again, thank you to Trolleys for sponsoring this video. I appreciate you guys, and have a magical day, everyone.